Welcome to Anatomy Karma for the skeletal system. You are using an app intended to help community college students to study and learn anatomy of the skeletal system. The app that is complete with tutoring in addition to visual information. In this review, we're going to look at difficult to find challenging surface markings of the appendicular skeleton. And in our discovery, we will use a highly visible landmark and relate the difficult to see parts to that landmark. Clavicle and radius are not part of this review. They have fairly straightforward, easy to see parts. So our review will start with the posterior scapula. And our landmark will be this strong bony ridge, the scapular spine, which ends in an acromion. And the toughest to find surface marking on the posterior scapula is the coracoid process. This is a finger-like structure immediately underneath the acromion in this view. On the anterior scapula, we are going to use this coracoid process as our landmark. And the hardest to find surface marking on the anterior scapula is this scapular notch, this semicircular indentation on the superior border of the scapula. On the anterior humerus, we will use the head of the humerus as a landmark. The head is an easy to see, large semicircular smooth surface. Opposite side to the head are the two tubercles. The bigger one is the greater tubercle, and a smaller one is the lesser tubercle. The head is also helping us to find the medial epicondyle. Head of humerus is a medially pointing structure. So on the same side, we'll see the medial epicondyle. Opposite to the medial epicondyle is the lateral epicondyle, the small bony structure. In between the two epicondyles, there's a small depression called the coronoid fossa. And if we look at the lateral epicondyle and follow that towards the end of the bone, we find this round raised surface, the capitulum. And right next to the capitulum, there's this long grooved structure, the trochlea. On the posterior humerus, we will use the head as the landmark. Yet again, it's a smooth, rounded, large surface. And again, the medial epicondyle is on the same side as the head. The lateral epicondyle is on the opposite side. In between the two epicondyles, on the posterior view, is the olecranon fossa. This is a large depression on this posterior view of the humerus. On the ulna, we will use the trochlear notch as our landmark. The trochlear notch or semilunar notch is this large indentation in this thick portion of the ulna. To the right of the trochlear notch is the olecranon process. The lower lip of the trochlear notch is the coronoid process. And immediately under the coronoid process, we'll see the radial notch. This is a smooth indentation. On the anterior hand and wrist bones, we will use the metacarpal of the thumb as a landmark. The thumb is easy to find. It's shortest, has only two phalanges, and that's why the metacarpal of the thumb is a good landmark. If you follow the metacarpal to its end, you'll see the bone trapezium. This is the first bone of the distal row of the wrist bones. This is followed by trapezoid, capitate, and hamate. Notice that all these 4 wrist bones make contact with other metatarsals. Coming back to the metacarpal of the thumb, once we find the trapezium, underneath the trapezium, there's scaphoid. And from scaphoid, you can find the 4 wrist bones of the proximal row. From scaphoid, we'll move on to the lunate, triquetrum, and pisiform. You can use the same landmark, the metacarpal of the thumb, on the posterior view of the hand as well. On the lateral view of coxal bones, our first landmark will be the iliac crest. The harder to find surface markings are these iliac spines. So let's find the posterior portion of the iliac crest. This is the area that looks like a flag is waving in the air. So the bony bump right here is the posterior superior iliac spine. A little bit below, a bigger bump is the posterior inferior iliac spine. And this flag also reveals this large indentation, the greater sciatic notch. On the anterior end of the iliac crest, we'll find the anterior superior iliac spine, and below that, the anterior inferior iliac spine. Another landmark that we'll use is the obturator foramen. And to the right of the obturator foramen in this view is the pubic symphysis. To the left is this very thick ischial tuberosity, and a little bit above the ischial tuberosity, we find the ischial spine. On the medial aspect of the coxal bone, our landmark will be the iliac crest. And yet again, on the posterior, this waving flag type of structure, we'll find the posterior superior and a posterior inferior iliac spines. And anteriorly, we find the anterior superior, anterior inferior iliac spine. On the anterior view of the femur, we'll use the head as the landmark. Opposite to the head is the greater trochanter, but most importantly, the head is a medial structure, so we can immediately find the medial epicondyle on the opposite end of the femur. This is on the same side as the head, and opposite to the medial epicondyle is the lateral epicondyle, another bony bump on the femur. On the posterior femur, yet again, let's use the head as the landmark. Opposite to the head are the 2 trochanters, the greater and the lesser trochanter. From the greater trochanter, this bony ridge immediately on top here, a little thick right here. This is the gluteal tuberosity. And yet again, the head defines the medial aspect of this bone. So the same side as the head, we'll find a medial epicondyle. Opposite side is the lateral epicondyle. From this view, the posterior femur shows us round articulating surfaces, the condyles. So yet again, the medial condyle is on the same side as the head, and the lateral condyle is on the opposite side to the medial condyle. On the tibia, we will use this medial malleolus as the landmark, this finger-like downward pointing process. The medial malleolus is on the same side as the medial condyle. which is a large round structure on the proximal end of the tibia. And opposite to the medial condyle is the lateral condyle, this also large rounded structure. On a fibula, our landmark will be the head. This is a round end of this bone, and the opposite end of the bone is round but also pointy. This is the harder to find surface marking, the lateral malleolus. On the foot, let's use first the calcaneus as the landmark. This is where our heel's located. This is the largest bone of the foot. Talus and cuboid are articulating with the calcaneus. Our second landmark will be the metatarsal of the big toe. This thickest of the metatarsals lead us to the first cuneiform. And going medially from the first cuneiform, going laterally from the first cuneiform, we go to the second and the third cuneiform.